This is the London Fintech Podcast, bringing you practical insights and approaches, stories and inspiration from the innovators who are building the new world of financial services. This podcast is brought to you by NextWave, strategy specialists and solutions for financial institutions. This is the London Fintech Podcast, and today's show is a special one, partly because we're together in the studio rather than online, and partly because we get to talk about AI. AI has been the topic of pretty much every episode, somewhere in the discussion over the last year. But this morning, we're just going to talk about AI as the focus of the show. And I'm delighted to be joined by someone who's a true leader in the sector and has got a pretty unique perspective on what the major institutions, particularly across the city, financial institutions, are doing with AI, and perhaps what they could be doing more of as well. So I'm here with EJ Achtner, former head of Group AI at HSBC.
Small startup,
yeah. And Ed, during your tenure at HSBC, the firm rose through the Evident rankings, is now top 10 listed. The business led on many AI initiatives across the businesses and functions. How would you characterize your period running AI at one of the world's largest banks?
Sure. So it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you very much for having me. And I guess before we start, I should say at this point, anything I say is my own personal opinion, not reflective of my prior employers, that being principally HSBC or Bank of America, or the future employers that I haven't necessarily announced yet,
yes.
Because at this point in time, I have the luxury and the privilege of taking some time out from that corporate space and advising some amazing, AI startups. So everything you're about to hear is my personal opinion and that only. So how to do that. Coming back to your question, it was incredible to have a front row seat, particularly at this point in time. Let's also take a step back and realize that artificial intelligence has been with the world, with financial services, for quite a long time. By some sense, well over a decade. And over those years, it's gone through many different transformations, many different iterations, and many different names, whether it's traditional AI or machine learning. But clearly today, we're at a different point in time. And why is that? Because as we all know, just to kind of repeat the oft-quoted statistic, the world essentially did change on November 30th of 2022 when ChatGPT was released to the world, which basically brought this incredible frontier technology into pretty much the hands of everyone who had a mobile device. And that kicked off a flurry of activities, which, we're going to talk about today, not just within banking and financial services, but, really the world kind of writ large. To be at an organization as globally impactful as HSBC, to have the privilege to help build upon that legacy and take it even further. Folks can go through my LinkedIn profile to see some of those accomplishments. No need to kind of drain that here. But it was both an honor and a privilege. And I think most importantly for me, because what I really am passionate about is building cool things, having that platform to learn, to grow, to positively impact customers and teammates, and to surround myself with an ecosystem of, talent, teammates, and partners that really open the doors to really seeing, ultimately what's possible. But also at the same time, understanding, particularly when it comes to regulated industries, you do need to take a measured approach because at the end of the day, you're serving a customer. Customers expect and deserve a great experience. So just because something is possible doesn't necessarily mean it's fit for purpose. And that was kind of the big learning at that point in time. But very proud of what was accomplished at my tenure there.
And I love something you said there. I got this very much talking prior to the show that you're all about building things.
Yeah.
Perhaps just to set a little context, in running global AI for HSBC, what was your remit and role, and what do you think was driving that league table position on the Evident ranking? That was a significant improvement on the previous year.
Sure, it was. And I will say, particularly at an organization as complex and as federated as HSBC, something as profoundly transformational as artificial intelligence is very much a team sport. My specific role and title was Group Head of Generative Artificial Intelligence Capabilities. So at the end of the day, it was building those production-grade capabilities that were expected to scale and be used by teammates and customers, ultimately to create a better experience, drive value, kind of lower and reduce costs, all those things that are oft quoted around why AI, and particularly generative AI, could be used as an effective enabler. Now, Evident's an interesting one because, that team was quite early in their understanding of kind of that approach of how do you measure success when it comes to AI? Because I think there's a lot of, and I've said this before, publicly, and I'll say it again, there is a lot of success theater out there. People will go out and do high fives because maybe they've landed a use case or they've launched a data science workbench. But oftentimes, and candidly in my personal opinion, most times, those outcomes are often decoupled from true benefits that, a customer will feel, a teammate will feel, and I think that's where Evident's gotten it right because they really look at 4 pillars. And I'm not here to shill Evident AI, but I will say of all the things that are out there, it does the best job at kind of measuring talent and innovation and transparency and leadership. And to kind of circle back to the heart of your question, I think one of the things that HSBC as an organization understood is that you have to bring your customers and your teammates along on the journey, and a winning culture is something that helps you do that. And telling that story publicly around how you responsibly use artificial intelligence for those benefits, it not only gives comfort to your regulators, it gives comfort to your teammates, and ultimately it differentiates yourself to your customers. So there happened to be at that point in time an alignment of interest, and those activities that were being done were, I think, properly reflected, and the team has a lot to be proud of, particularly when it came to the pillars of leadership and transparency. And if I recall the statistics from a transparency perspective, HSBC was number 3. From a leadership perspective, it was number 5, and then overall it was number 7 globally. And the team, both then and now, has a lot to be proud of for that. Very much a team sport.
Yeah, I think that point about teamwork and the culture is so important. I think we're going to come back to it. So you were heading global focus and global initiatives on AI, driving everything that the bank was doing. And just for the audience, a little bit of background. You mentioned,
Sure.
I think Bank of America, that's
Sure.
where you started out, and this focus on building product. But how did you find yourself in that role,
Sure.
I guess?
So a little bit of a highlight reel about me. If you go way back in time, I'm dating myself. Depending upon the resolution of the camera, you could probably see gray hair and a lack thereof. So I've been around a while. A while means if you go back to the mid-'80s, I was the geeky kid playing on the Apple IIe, with 128K memory and a green monitor and a whopping 12, to 2400 baud modem. So building things and that geek at heart, as I tell my kids, that's just part of who I am. And if you look at the arc of my career, which has taken some interesting turns over the years, kind of the builder in me, the curious child in me, is always front and center. So whether it was doing things quite literally when I was a teenager, up until the reason I actually went to law school, not to be a lawyer because I thought it was a great intellectual toolkit. And at law school, where I was in Washington, D.C., I ended up doing 2 startups. One was successful, one was not. So 50-50. That was in the late 90s.
Those are good odds, I think.
It was, as those things go. And then my now amazing wife of nearly 25 years told me to get off the couch and do something. I found myself at Bank of America, where I had a wonderful run of nearly 15 years, which brought myself and the family from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco in the 2000s. And then basically moving through Bank of America, had the privilege, again, of running the retail digital product portfolio. So mobile banking, consumer AI at the time, whatever you would have called it at that point in time, desktop, digital design, with great partnerships at universities like Stanford and the design school. So again, that builder in me coming out. And then for a variety of reasons, it was an incredible opportunity to join HSBC over 7 years ago in San Francisco, based there with some incredible leaders. And then ultimately, the family and I moved here to London, where we've loved it, absolutely. We've been here since the summer of 21. And as of the date of this recording, it's very likely we'll be going home to San Francisco this summer, but for a role not to be yet announced. I'm sorry, I'm not going to break the news here because I don't want to front run that, but it's something that's going to be very exciting. That's going to allow me to kind of build off an incredible platform too.
Yeah, so a great story, and sort of explains the vantage point that you've had on the industry coming up through your career, and most particularly, obviously, in the last year or two, on a real focus on AI. How would you characterize the state of the industry currently, EJ?
The state of the industry. So by industry, do you mean banking in particular?
I mean AI adoption and AI leverage across FS, probably banking focus.
So I think it's clear that the barriers to entry to using this stuff, and we'll talk about what this stuff is, the barriers to entry are coming down. The cost to a typical end user is zero, if not nearly zero. What do I mean by that? It's on your phone, it's on your tablet, it's on your desktop. So most people have access to most things, which allow them to do a lot of interesting things. So that barrier to entry in terms of cost and accessibility is down. Yes, clearly if you want to play at the frontier, the latest models, large and small, the latest inference, the latest training, clearly at that edge, there's kind of a subset of organizations and partnerships that let you play and learn and build like at the edge. But as we're going to talk about, that's not necessary for most organizations to do most things. So we're going to hopefully get into my personal views on product market fit and organizational maturity. But I would say, as with all things related to technology, two things can basically be true at the same time. You're going to have a population of individuals, both personally and within enterprise, that are very much on the leading edge of this. Okay, and that's always been the case with any large technological capability. And you're also going to have laggards. And then somewhere in between, you're going to have people that are struggling to keep up, and you're going to have naysayers that are going to say this has no part. I do think, hopefully not with naivete, I do think this is different because I think people, again, because the barriers to entry are so low, if non-existent at all, particularly as a user, but increasingly as a builder. And I also think whether you want to just put your head in the sand, the first, second, or third order impacts of artificial intelligence will touch everyone, even my 85-year-old mother who doesn't even have a phone. How and who she interacts with, whether it's with her personal health care, whether it's her bank back in the United States, AI is going to impact that interaction model, whether she wants it or not. So kind of coming back to your question, there are going to be some enterprises and organizations that are going to run really quickly. They're likely to make mistakes. There are going to be others who take a more measured approach, particularly if they're a regulated industry. And then you're going to have this kind of continuum of adoption. I'm going to say one final thing on this with respect to adoption. There is a legitimate and to be respected fear factor with this at the level of disruption, both from a societal perspective, but also from a workforce perspective. And in my observation, beyond my former employers, those organizations which understand that, accept that, and really kind of engage the workforce to bring them on through the journey to make sure that they're educated, that they're engaged, that they understand how this can positively impact them, you will see adoption rise commensurately with that level of engagement. And you will see those organizations not only benefit in terms of how they can now apply it in the real world, but also bring their talent along with them. And unless they do that, they're running a real risk of workforce disruption.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk a bit more about workforce and adoption and a bit more about governance in regulated industry as well in a few minutes. Just to sort of get into this, what's the best AI use case that you've seen in the sector? Or most successful AI implementation so far?
Well, this is, I'm going to have to be, because there's certain things that are publicly out there, and there are certain things which I'm aware of which are not publicly out there, both within my legacy organizations and others. I will say, in terms of AI use cases that are publicly out there, those that would achieve, I think, product market fit. Now, what do I mean by that? That's the second time I've said product market fit. Well, that's that very complex Venn diagram of, am I solving a customer need? Do I have the right level of high quality data to support that? Do I have the right technology kind of infrastructure and architecture? And am I not breaking the law, right? And that's a very kind of complex, dynamic set of circles. And especially if you overlay and juxtapose that over kind of international use cases, it gets really complicated really quickly. And it's almost like nonlinear in complexity. The ones that I've seen, and I'm not going to call it a use case, I'm going to call it more of a pattern. Okay, and there is a difference between the two. Things having to do with kind of software engineering and data science, like the days I think of, having to have like low-level coding and kind of programming. A lot of the more, not even so much the frontier models now, but even the stuff that's a few years old, you're really able to augment, the productivity of your organization, reduce costs, higher quality code, maker, checker. So you're really able to kind of augment your technology organization. The other kind of pattern I would say is around knowledge management. What do I mean by that specifically? Enterprises, large or small, but particularly large, complex organizations are just sitting on so much data, it's hard to find stuff. And increasingly, the ability to find that proverbial needle in a haystack and to do so repeatably with high quality, measurable outcomes to get the right answer in the right context, that's more and more possible each minute that goes by. So the gap between like I need to find an answer on something and how can I reliably get that gap is now shrinking. So those use cases that would fall under connecting at a task level, the right user with the right data to do a thing, whatever that thing or task is, I think those are increasingly successful and will actually yield true, benefits. So those I think would be the kind of the patterns I would say right now, would achieve product market fit. And just the last thing on that, there is a lot of experimentation. There is a lot of sandboxes. There's a lot of proof of concepts, and that's great. But at the end of the day, can that graduate to a place where you're actually using it in production to create value? And that's the hard part.
Yeah. There's quite a lot in that answer. We talk a lot about product market fit on this show. And I was talking to the founders of one of the AI companies that's been on LFP just this week. And that development productivity point, their view was they were 80% more productive. That their CIO and dev lead was probably writing 15% of the code, and the rest was being written by the AI.
Yeah.
And the other point about knowledge repository and document AI, I think there are some applications out there that are probably unkindly called chatbots that are doing a bit more than that. And we'll get into it in a few minutes, but where does that go once you have agentic and you have execution and autonomy built in? I mean, it all gets very interesting. Yeah. But back to the point about leaders and followers, what do you think the leaders in AI adoption in the FS sector, what are they doing right?
So number one, a leader in artificial intelligence, to me, is going to have a certain number of these following attributes or ingredients. Number one, are you properly engaging your workforce to be a part of that? Now, that can take on a few different things. That does not, let's also talk about what that does not mean. It does not mean that everyone has the kind of the gift and the mandate to go out and build their own stuff, okay? You come to work every day at your organization to serve the customer, okay? And that customer is provided a level of services, or in the parlance of business architecture, a business service catalog, so when you bank with a bank, there's certain things that you expect. When you have your cable or satellite TV company, it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, your organization provides, a certain level of services with an expectation around those services, to kind of deliver them with world-class, kind of delivery. So to empower everyone to kind of go off, and build their own stuff, there's a difference between structured innovation that ultimately helps better serve, because make no mistake, like there can be no hubris when it comes to this, especially when you're dealing, with people, around the world with a vast level of talent. You want to kind of foster that sense of innovation. But at the end of the day, you need to channel that, into an improvement for the customer, for the shareholder, for the teammate, that you can actually measure and prove. So what does that mean? So a successful organization is going to have a certain level of maturity in its operating model that can take all this wonderful experimentation that's out there and have that be as appropriate and as broad as possible, but channel that in, to actual outcomes that, make the loan process better, improve a contact center, just all those things that you would expect, okay? And I think in many respects, many organizations realize, as profound as AI is, it needs to be treated as an enabler and as an accelerator. And so it's not about the AI itself. It's about helping you do those things that you do, better so that the customer results. So having that clear clinical focus on what you do, who you do it for, and how you measure it, you got to start there. The second thing is, do you ultimately have the right operating model? And there's a lot of opinion on this, that can deliver those services. And particularly when it comes to kind of large organizations, you have to respect the fact that there are certain people, who are closest to the customer, and they understand the customer needs, they understand the customer problems, and their voice needs to be front and center with the product owners to understand what's being built. Again, don't high five because you've delivered a data science workbench. High five because you've improved a lending process or a mortgage process or a credit card process that benefits the customer. So you have to kind of connect it back to your strategy. And the last thing is, I would say that you have to be able to have a set, whether it's, and this is going to get a little geeky, whether it's your KPIs or your OKRs, how do you make sure that your organization is really thinking about, again, AI as an enabler, again, to do the things that you do? So you have to create the right incentive structure and realize that you're going to have a varying continuum of people on this journey. So again, it goes back to that education and engagement. Are they trained? Do they know how to do it? Are you embracing it in your organization? Are you hearing the tone from the top with your leadership? But are you also allowing kind of the right products and services to be built? I think those organizations that think AI is just something different are going to find pretty rapidly they're going to be in this swirl of perpetual POCs that aren't going to ultimately kind of connect to an outcome. Those organizations that have a certain operating model that realize that when you build a thing, it has to be resilient, it has to be high quality, and you can't let the entire organization do that. You have to have the experts do that while fostering the totality of the organization's innovative, spirit and connecting those two worlds together. And that's really hard for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, it's a critical balance to strike, but starting with the business outcome and focusing on that, I think is critical. How do you put it, sort of positive innovation, but within guide rails with that focus on the business outcome. And Gartner, I think, said last week that 85% of AI projects will never reach production. And I was thinking about that and I thought, what is that a problem? I was actually, that innovation cycle, fail fast and learn from it. If they're in that innovation cycle but still moving towards the business goals, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. Do you have a view on that?
Well, I think the issue is even broader than that. And this is where, again, I have to stress this in my personal opinion. Whether you look at it, Gartner, top quadrant, when, that fundamental question, whether it's 85%, it's a very high percentage. And the reality is a lot of the technology companies, okay, those who are building these models, those who are building these frontier capabilities, they don't understand regulated industries. They think they do. They hire expensive go-to-market, kind of teams, and some of them get it really right. I'm not going to name those that do, but most of them don't get it right when it comes to regulated industries. And let me be very specific about that, okay? And let me be, very objective. When you look at some of the latest models, and it feels like every single day, this horse race of who's got the better model, they do that because, number one, there's bragging rights. They have to justify their valuations, after their multiple, kind of rounds and why they think they're going to be able to kind of derive revenue from that. But they're often speaking to the wrong audience. They're speaking to a certain bubble that exists in the lovely Bay Area, which I hail from, or other places. And it's all about these benchmarks and standards that are kind of within that bubble. The best software development, the best this, the best that. I have not seen, although with a few exceptions that I'm not going to name here, it's not necessarily about the best model for a bank, the best model for healthcare, the best model for government, right? the benchmarks and standards that are often used by a lot of these frontier companies, they're almost like these research houses that have built multi-billion-dollar research capabilities, that are very, very focused on a finite number of end users, largely like the software development community or PhD equivalent kind of, agentic or even kind of models. I don't need a PhD to do wholesale credit underwriting. I need the world's best credit underwriter who understands credit. It doesn't matter to me if your latest LLM is the equivalent and you've benchmarked it against, some hypothetical 10 PhD level, student who's gotten perfect scores on their A levels or whatever it is. That does me no good if my tasks relate to my industry and my outcomes. So you've got these research, frontier labs building all this stuff over there. And then you've got, kind of banks and healthcare and government and the rest of us over here are trying to kind of fit that round peg into a square hole. And they're like, but we built a really, really smart, model. And I'm like, great. Does it understand credit? Can it, issue a better mortgage? And then there's a lot of hard work in between to kind of fit those things together. And so this is where it kind of goes back to your first question around use cases and maturity. It takes a lot of talent. It takes a lot of depth. It takes a lot of work over here kind of in the bank, in the healthcare company, in the government, in end user land to kind of get these models to work for that service catalog. And most frontier companies out there that you can name who are bragging about the latest model on the league table, they are so decoupled from those kind of end users. That's where they're struggling for kind of product market fit. And they're sitting there wondering, why aren't more people paying for our models? It's I don't need 10 PhDs. I need a great mortgage credit underwriter who understands the mortgage business, and you haven't built that. And that's where the challenge is.
Yeah, and I think the market has moved on in any case. So it's not about, and you said this about the latest model, it's about the education, the literacy, the change management, the operating model,
that's right.
Bringing the organization with you.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely fundamental for firms to really be able to engage whole scale with the potential of AI.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't understand why, the best pairing I've seen is not only when you have rock star, product owners and data scientists understand that, but they have to be paired with process engineering and process design gurus. And, when you suggest that, people are often like, well, why? It's well, at the end of the day, you're delivering a service and you want to have a re-envisioned process. Well, guess what? You better know whether it's, one model or we're going to talk about agentic, how you get from A to B, repeatably high quality. That fundamentally is a process. And whether AI is 1, 5, 10, 50, 90% of that process, you better be able to, understand how you got from A to B and do so in a repeatable, measurable way. Otherwise you're going to be in real trouble, whether with your regulator, with your customer, with your shareholder, or with your teammate, because things can't break, right? And so that to me is why you have to have process engineers, really sitting side by side with your AI teams to kind of accelerate this stuff to go faster.
Yeah, the cornerstones are people, process, data, and technology. And it feels to me like the technology dimension has sort of raced ahead and is evolving every week. But the rest is going to have to catch up. Otherwise, this is...
especially with the data.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, data foundations, absolutely critical. So we've talked a lot about AI adoption and perhaps best practices for that and how you get product market fit. There's another side to this, which, of course, is governance and risk.
Yep.
And that's never far from anyone's agenda in looking at their AI strategy. And with Gen AI, there's the risk of bias and hallucination. We know what's the model going to generate. Yeah. With agentic AI, then you start thinking about what's it going to do. Is it going to take a decision? What's it going to do with my customer? Yeah, big topic. But what are your thoughts on practical governance and human in the loop?
Sure.
And there's maker checker models and and all of that. How should institutions be looking at this?
Sure. So this is a really important question, particularly right now. I feel like we're repeating many of the aspects of 2023. Let me tell you what I mean by that. But now it's we're already repeating those sins here in 2025. What do I mean? So in 2023, okay, the world was abuzz. You had the frontier models of the time kind of out there. They were connected to natural language interface chatbots. They could start to do these things. And there was this magic that started to happen. And then people started to be like, well, how do I take that off my phone and bring it into my enterprise? And for those reasons, Gartners and others have observed a lot of those tests and those POCs, they never made it into production. And there's a wide variety of reasons, many of which we've talked about, whether it's data, whether it's unclear regs, whether it's operational and organizational immaturity. But bridging that gap, for relatively benign use cases to get into production was a challenge then. And I'm going to talk about agentic. And it was a challenge then because, especially when it comes to regulated industries, but not just that. If you're delivering a service, I'm going to repeat myself again, to a customer, okay, that customer expects, they don't want to be surprised. They want to have their questions answered with a high level of quality. They want their problem solved. And they want to certainly be delighted. But at the end of the day, those table stakes of delivering your services with a high level of quality, that's paramount. Now, particularly when it comes to regulated industries, you have to be able to prove that. Okay. And we could spend hours in other podcasts of the nuances of model risk management. But at the end of the day, like what used to be called a model, which colleagues in capital markets have been familiar with for a very long time, well before generative AI. At the end of the day, you got a bunch of data and you got a bunch of calculations, and it's figuring out some stuff. And at the end of that, what spits out of that, is it repeatable? Is it measurable? Can you test it time and time and time and time again? And some of these models are profoundly impactful. They have the ability to literally disrupt the financial markets. So the amount of rigor involved with model risk management and testing is significant for all the right reasons. At the same time, okay, generative AI comes along, and something as benign as a chatbot of, help me find this information, okay? It may not move like the financial markets, but at the same time, you expect it to be repeatable. So, help me understand this policy or procedure. Well, how do you know from a control perspective that the model, that you may not have built because it's coming from a frontier lab, is going to give you the same answer time and time again? That's right. Because right or wrong, even though there's a human in the loop, all of the data and all of the research says that over time, there's going to be bias that comes out where the human is going to have increasing reliance on the model, on the chatbot that's given this. Right or wrong, that is the reality, and that's what all the research says. So you have to be able to prove, even for the lowest level risk use cases, that the answers coming out of this stuff is going to be repeatable and measurable. And if you abstract that at a higher level, you have to have within your enterprise a risk management framework that can account for that continuum of truly market-making kind of risk where there's just, an unbelievable amount of testing, to how do you account for lower level risk use cases, okay? And that's, again, why in 2023, a lot of this stuff never made it out of, POC sandboxes into production. So now here we are, together in March of 2025, and everyone's talking about agentic. And I find it interesting that organizations, that struggled, to get even lower level, use cases into production, now think they're going to skip ahead and have multi-agent ecosystems that are autonomous, performing, all part, or some part of an end-to-end business process. Now, I think that's going to be a challenge because going back to organizational maturity, do you have the right risk framework? Do you have a right understanding of the law? Do you have the right teams in place? Do you have the right testing and evaluation, right? And so I think it's going to take time for most enterprises, okay, to adopt at production most types of agentic use cases. There will be bits and pieces here and there, but if you're going to put an agent into the wild, you have to be able to prove that that agent is doing the right thing, at a task level. And especially if you have a chain of agents, that identity chain along the way, agent A, agent B, agent C, are they all doing the right sequence and the right thing so you get that outcome? So it will happen. It will take longer than most people think. It will release another level of value to be created, but I don't think it's going to happen as quickly as most people think it will.
Yeah. And we were talking ahead of the show about the maker and checker model, and is it valid to have a risk or a compliance agent checking the work
That's right.
of the customer agents, for example? Right. And I think the conclusion was it would be, because the accuracy rates and the same principles about training and measuring the efficacy of those of those checkers would apply. But if you can calibrate it correctly, then that's one of the ways that you can provide the monitoring and testing.
That's right.
At what point do you bring the human in? And there was an interesting bit of math, I think, last time we spoke about how many humans you would need to actually sample test and oversee a process that would undoubtedly scale out.
So let's talk about that as a hypothetical thought exercise. So let's take a very benign use case, like, hey, name your agent. Can you please summarize for me, the annual report and key financials for company X over the last 3 years? Something that I think most people would agree is a pretty benign use case is you're taking a bunch of documentation, which may number in the hundreds of pages from, 3 or 4 annual reports. And you're basically telling your friendly neighborhood chatbot to kind of summarize it for you. Very benign, okay? But now let's put that in the context of an enterprise. So you and I can do that all day long in our personal AI systems. We can go to public company websites, we can upload that, and we can do that. And we're going to get a good answer. But then the question is, how do we know it's good? Now, let's take that same scenario and you and I work in an organization. Doesn't matter what organization it is, but now let's put that in the context. We're going to do the same exact thing, but it's part of a, company review. Maybe it's for a new loan, maybe it's for a renewal, maybe you're onboarding it, whatever it might be. It doesn't even have to be a bank, right? So we're going to do the same thing. Tony and I need to understand for the last 3 years, what are the key kind of financial outcomes? And here's the last 4 annual reports, 500 pages, okay? So it's going to spit out an answer, okay? Sounds good, okay? But now we're in the context of relying on that output as part of a business process. And that business process is going to have an impact to the customer. And that impact might be quite significant because you're lending that company $1 billion, or it might not be significant at all because you're doing it for a brief, for an executive who's going to meet with that company. But it could be any of those things, right? How do you then ultimately know that what the agent or agents kind of spit out to you, is comprehensive, is accurate, and can be relied upon? Okay, so now you have to be able to test that, okay? So you have a few ways of doing that. Now just think about this, very practically for a moment. Are you going to have an army of individuals at some offshore or onshore service center that are literally going to start sample testing all of those answers? So humans reading through all those annual reports would be like, hey, that answer, that's 100%, 90%, 80% hallucination. First of all, do they even know how to measure the answer? That's an open question. Do they know how to quantify the measurement of that answer? And then are you sampling it enough so that that answer in the context of that enterprise can be relied upon? And to make a long story short, to do that at scale, well, either the organization is going to have to hire an army of checkers, okay, to make sure that that summary is accurate. They're going to have to change their risk standards. They're going to have to bring in tooling, okay, that can do the sample testing and the valuation automated basis. There's some combination of 3. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think most organizations are going to lower their risk standards, nor do I think should they, okay? If you start hiring an army of AI checkers, okay, you're pretty much underwater on your ROI really quickly, because what's the point? So now you're at a question of tooling. And this is where there is just so much tooling that's out there. But again, I think for most tasks in most organizations, it's not going to fundamentally answer the question of, the agent or agents have answered with this level of accuracy and model risk agrees with it. So this is kind of the dilemma to why things aren't getting into production and scaling, even for what, would be the most benign use case. Because even if you have just a handful of maker checkers, and I've done the back of the envelope math on this, it would take years for them to actually go through a basic level of volume and sample testing at any organization that hopes to do this at scale. So that can't be the way. And this is, I think, part of the big challenge that we have.
And we've touched on agentic. We've been talking about it for the last few minutes. And I was going to ask you whether you're excited or terrified. I sort of had the answer.
The answer is yes.
We sort of had some of the answer, which is excited, but it may not happen very quickly because of the issues we've been talking about there. We've done some agentic experimentation with our solution team, and one of the things that we're hearing is that the personas can drift. So you think you've got an agent that's going to play this role consistently, but actually over time that persona can morph. So that's an interesting dynamic.
I'm going to put my philosophical hat on too for a moment, and this is where I don't know what the answer is, but humans drift all the time.
A good day,
humans
bad
are
day.
imperfect. This is why we have 3 lines of defense in financial services. This is why there's maker-checker. This is why there's resilience built in the processes. I don't think any of us believe that when we walk to the door in whatever our line of work is, we expect absolute 100% perfection in the teammates that we have to deliver an outcome. And if you do, you haven't been around enough, okay? It seems like, and it feels like, in my personal opinion, is we have this expectation and level of belief that, an AI, I don't want to personify it, but an AI agent does operate at a level of perfection, whereas when we walk in the door, there's a whole set of controls and a control environment around our human colleagues to make sure we do the best that we can in the context of what's expected of us. And obviously, the control environment gets more and more intense depending upon the level of risk that human is taking on. And I think the challenge is that, we allow for this kind of continuum of humans, but when it comes to AI, we have an expectation of the level of perfection. And again, this is getting into, the philosophical side of it, but is an enterprise going to allow for certain levels of fallibility and imperfection in its agents? And if so, is it going to allow them to kind of play in a space where there's maker checkers to kind of learn and grow, which I actually think is where you should be doing it, before you kind of unleash them just as you would with a human? Put it this way, like you wouldn't expect a grad, 1 year out of uni to kind of step into, the business process of a high risk, kind of service and be a decision maker day one. It might take years and years and years. Why would you expect it's okay for like an AI agent to kind of step in that role day one? Like there's no difference here, right? So I do think agentic is going to be adopted, and I think over time it's going to kind of move up that value chain. But I also think, particularly because of open source, which we haven't even touched upon yet, the world that kind of operates around these organizations, again, those barriers to entry being low, a lot of organizations are going to have to deal with the fact that open source is there, and a lot of folks like you and I are just going to be able to build their own stuff. And how are you going to be able to kind of absorb what that impact means to your organization too?
Yeah, I mean, the agentic evolution is posing so many interesting questions. And there are case studies emerging of humans working with synthetic workers in teams in real enterprise situations. And
hybrid workforce.
And what's the career plan and the HR policy for a digital worker? But let's not go there because we haven't got enough time. You touched on technology. This is the London Fintech Podcast, so the clues in the title. We should talk about technology for at least a few minutes. There's a whole plethora of platform plays and open source coming out, and you've got obviously Microsoft Copilot and then Operator, and you've got OpenAI and the agentic toolkit, things like Crew AI, and then you've got the big platform plays from the likes of ServiceNow, who said that they've trained thousands of agents and they've got an orchestration canvas, and that's in the current release. So super interesting landscape, and there's definitely some positioning for this is the platform that you should build your digital workforce of the future on. I mean, how do you see this all playing out and the winners and losers?
It's hard. We could have literally spent the hour, you and I, just together reading the names of companies that are either in the space or are formed in the last 36 months and done nothing other than just reading names. It's hard. It's complex. And the way I would simplify and abstract this very complex landscape is you have your business. I'm going to be very simple. You have your business services that you provide to your customers. You lend the money. You take deposits, you operate a contact center, you provide them with medicine or whatever it is, whatever your business service catalog is, okay? Unless you're going to profoundly change what you do for your customers, okay, which your board or shareholders are probably going to have something to say about. Let's assume for a moment that, You are who you are, and you're going to kind of deliver those services in the future. Now you have a really difficult choice of piecing together the right buy and build strategy, the right platform plays, the right stack. But fundamentally, again, EJ's opinion, my opinion, AI is an enabler and an accelerator to do the things that you're already doing better. That's your first principle. Then you need to kind of go out and you need to make sure you have the right team. Because at the end of the day, any third party that you do business with, okay, they're not the ones who are going to get the phone calls when stuff breaks, okay? So do you have the right responsible and accountable team, in your organization to kind of make those hard decisions that are expected to deliver, what we would used to have called a tier 0 or tier 1 service. It's running, it's up, it's predictable, it's resilient. Then you've got, the right leadership in place that has to make those hard decisions, based upon the complexity of the organization. Who are the right partners? Do we buy? Do we build? This is no different, than a lot of other stuff that folks like you and I have seen over the years. And some organizations, understand regulated industries, and they are much closer to product market fit, which makes saying yes that much easier. And others are out there and they, have built something which is so far away from product market fit in regulated industries that, they just don't have a chance. And then the last thing I would say is, depending upon where you operate around the world, again, it's nonlinear in complexity. If you're just doing business, here in the United Kingdom, awesome. If you're doing business in 60, 90, 120 countries, that's a whole other level of complexity. And that means that the partners that you choose, you could probably count on one or two hands. And then there's still a whole lot of customization in place to make sure that it's fit for purpose.
So
it's a tough question.
It's complicated. That
Really
navigation challenge is going to be hard.
Yeah.
And I guess there's probably going to be a move to the scale players. We've seen it in the model aspect of the platforms, and I suspect there's going to be quite a strong case for on the agentic side of things as well.
All that said is none of that stuff's going to work really well unless your own house is in order when it comes to your data. And you can Band-Aid as much of that stuff as you can, but unless your data is of requisite quality and accessibility that agent or agents can actually do the stuff you expect it to do, so your data, and then your workforce. These are the two constants in my mind. Do you have the right data and do you have the right team? And if you have both of those things in place, a lot of the other stuff you can figure out. But if your data is a mess and you don't have the right operating model, you're never going to, realize the benefits of this stuff.
So for the audience, if you're in this space, what would be EJ's recommendations for the three things you could do tomorrow morning to get on the front foot with AI?
Number one, and this is really easy to do, okay? And it's not going to cost you a thing, believe it or not. And it is, I'm going to be the broken record, educate and empower your workforce to understand this. So what are those baseline things around the rules of the road, okay? So that they understand, what does AI mean? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to my organization? Because it's not going away. So educate your workforce. You will find that you have incredible talent in the organization that you didn't even realize was there, and they will kind of come into their own and you will figure out what to do with them, which is very empowering and beneficial for the organization because talent is expensive and moving talent in and out is doubly expensive, okay? So educate and empower your workforce. Once you've got that, and whether it's agentic, whether it's kind of more traditional, having that educated workforce, okay, more than just sounds good, it allows you to put stuff into production and realize the benefit of this much faster because they know how to use it responsibly and they know how to use it effectively. So it's an accelerator. That's number one. Number two, we talked about it, won't drain it again on the data. Okay, whether it's, your policies and procedures, whatever it is, the data that you're sitting on, you can't spend enough time or money to make sure that you understand. And it's, a level of accessibility and a level of quality that allows you to kind of bring these use cases into production. And number three, do you have that right organizational maturity and operating model that allows you to experiment safely at the edge, okay? But also be clinically understanding that only a certain amount of those use cases, led by highly proficient, talented teams, can kind of bring those things in production, okay? Not everyone can do that, so you have to have that entire pipeline of delivery. And if you have those three things in place, you'll get most of the things right most of the time.
Yeah, so education and data and your process and guide rails. And I think the education point is so interesting, actually, with the Next Wave team, where you set out AI capability as a strategic priority some time back, and then things come out of the woodwork. Yeah. So I had the solution team coming and I've been doing this on the weekend. I've built this. And you find the solutionists, you find the champions within your team as a process of really just raising the bar and trying to bring everyone's knowledge level up.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so for you more personally, EJ,
sure.
So you are, I guess it must feel a little unusual, you are temporarily not embedded in corporate life.
Correct.
So, but
I'm blissfully retired for a bit, although I would be wearing the hoodie even if I did that. That is me, and you can't see the shoes, but so fortuitously, I've got some time to work with some great companies, advise them, but most likely the family and I are headed back to San Francisco in a few months. For something to be announced.
Exciting next chapter that you can't talk about this morning.
That's right. Not for me to say yet.
Well, we'll be keeping an eye out for that.
Yeah.
And so given that you have slightly more, if I can say, leisure time now, perhaps or learning time.
Building time.
Reading and listening, or what are you reading or listening to? Obviously, apart from the London Fintech Podcast.
Apart from this amazing fintech, there's certain in my media diet, like anything that basically Professor Ethan Malik, comes out with. I think he is one of the leading voices. I spend a lot of time actually not reading a lot of the hype stuff that's out there. I'm hands-on with a lot of these tools. I'm very fortunate that I have access to a lot of these capabilities. So, there's no substitute for actually being hands-on and testing and learning and building and kind of pushing the envelope. So I tend to spend many hours, many days kind of building out my personal AI agents for things that I'm kind of doing on the side. And then third and final, there's a certain, podcasts or other things that I kind of listen to. But it tends to be either folks from university or from kind of the builders, themselves. And then there's just a kind of a handful of research articles that I read that are out there. Yeah.
I love that phrase, media diet. And Ethan Mollick, someone I follow as well, and wrote an amazing book called Co-Intelligence and has analysed AI working alongside humans. And I think one of the things I took away from that was that one of the studies looked at, I think it was 1,034 job types, and less than 30 of them were going to be untouched by AI. So whether you're in the legal profession, the consulting profession, or the banking profession, it's all set to change.
Centaurs and cyborgs is another one. At the jagged edge, that came out a few years ago, but I think it still is resonant today, particularly when you talk about agentic.
Yeah, we'll put the book links in the show notes. Yeah. Look, Ed, anyone want to find out more or contact you?
LinkedIn, probably the easiest way.
Yeah. So, All right. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's a super set of insights, and we'll have to draw it to a close there. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the time.